Today, on this fourth Sunday of Easter, it's traditionally known as Good Shepherd Sunday. Why? Because the gospel always comes on this Sunday, it always comes from the 10th chapter of John's gospel, where Jesus tells in various ways that he is the Good Shepherd. But stepping back for a moment, I just would like to put a little bit of context to the gospel that we just heard moments ago. Okay? So I'd just like to back up. We heard from John chapter 10, verses 27 through 30. But I'd like to step back just a little bit to the beginning of John's gospel, chapter 10. And so where is Jesus? It's important for us to know, where is Jesus in terms of just sort of the geography? So the setting is that this is during the Feast of Dedication. Now, the Feast of Dedication, it's an 8-day festival of lights that takes place in the temple. In Hebrew, it's known as Hanukkah. And this took place 3 months after the Feast of Tabernacles. And so earlier in John's Gospel, we hear it was winter. So the Feast of the Dedication took place in December. Now, what's the Feast of the Dedication then? Well, the Feast of the Dedication celebrates the Maccabees' rededication of the altar and the reconstruction of the temple that took place in 146 BC after the temple was desecrated by Antiochus IV. And evidence of this can be found in the book of the prophet Daniel and the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And so Jesus is in the midst of this big celebration of the Feast of the Dedication, where the people, after being in exile, they came back from exile, and they rebuilt, the Maccabees rebuilt the temple, and there is a great celebration that the people are able to worship God back in their native place. So that's sort of the calendar of where Jesus is at and where he's preaching. But then we're told something even more. We're told that Jesus was in the temple area, but he was in a specific place in the temple. And this specific place was known as Solomon's portico. Now, Solomon's portico, it was the outermost court of the temple, and it was surrounded by columns, or it was also known as a cloister. And so as you came to Mass this morning, when you came through the cloister, does everybody know where the cloister is? Some of you are like, yep. Some of you are like, nope, I've been using the side door for years. But the cloister is the main entrance of the church, the columns. So to kind of give you an idea, that's probably what it might have resembled, where Jesus is at. It wasn't necessarily the temple proper, but it was in the cloister area where Jesus is standing. And this area was facing east, and the facing east part is important because the winter wind from the desert, the cold weather, that Solomon's portico, it would shield the people from that cold wind blowing in from the desert. And so everybody is kind of gathering in this area of the temple. And so Jesus is around the temple, or the Feast of Dedication, a rededication. And he's incidentally, Solomon's portico is one of the oldest parts of the temple that was attributed to being built by Solomon. Remember when in 146, when they came back, they rebuilt the temple. But this area was much older. And so this is the context to Jesus speaking about shepherds, shepherding, and flocks. And so as Jesus spoke of this, as when the first time his followers heard it, it should also call our attention to something very important. That is the shepherds of the Old Testament. Specifically, two of them. Moses, in Exodus chapter 3, what was Moses doing? But Moses was actually tending the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro when he had the burning bush experience. And God called him to lead, to shepherd his people out of slavery and into the promised land. And the second shepherd that it should call our attention to in the Old Testament is the book of 1 Samuel. When this shepherd, who would later become King David, was tending the sheep of his father Jesse in the land of Bethlehem, in the town of Bethlehem. And so when Jesus uses this shepherding language, my sheep hear my voice, he's situating himself and announcing that he is in line with Moses. He's saying, I'm another Moses. He's saying, I'm in line with David, both of them who received God's law and followed God's law. And so, there's more to it, though. There's more to this. The gospel was very short this weekend, but there's more to it. Jesus is doing something else other than just reminding them of the shepherds of the past. And I think it's very key in that first line in the gospel, where he says, my sheep hear my voice. Remember, Jesus came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill it. And so as Jesus speaks of sheep hearing his voice, that also would have grabbed the attention of the people. And incidentally, friends, the people of Jesus' time, they would have got these connections right away. They knew the Bible backwards and forwards. They knew the Old Testament backwards and forwards. Children grew up learning their Bible. And so they would have got this right away. But what is this, my sheep hear my voice? What is Jesus doing here? But the people would have made the connection of the Old Testament prophet, not just any of them, but the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 34, to be exact. And in Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 11 and 15, Ezekiel 34, God speaks through him, and God is very critical of the shepherds. He is very critical of the leadership around his people. And so God says, look, I myself will search for my sheep. I myself will pasture my sheep. I myself will give them rest. You see, it isn't that these shepherds, these priests and leaders, it isn't that they were bad fundamentally. They were non-existent. They weren't around. And God says, I'm going to step in. These are my people. I will care for them because you shepherds are not doing it. And so Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice. Now, of course, it isn't until the end of the gospel, after he connects himself to this historical tradition of shepherding in the Old Testament, that he reveals that he is the fulfillment of Ezekiel. Because Jesus says, my Father has given them to me. The Father and I are one. His divinity is revealed right there. Some of them get it, some of them don't. Some of them won't until after the resurrection, till after that Easter Sunday. But you know what? In the midst of all those beautiful Old Testament imagery and connections that come up through this gospel passage, perhaps the message is much simpler. Perhaps Jesus is just reminding us how important it is to listen. My sheep hear. How important it is to listen to his voice. Oftentimes we might say, well, I can see God working here, and I know that God is here or God is there. I know, the operative word being know. But as Jesus reminds us that the sheep hear his voice, how is God speaking to you? How is Jesus speaking to you at home? Or at work? Or at school? Or at Mass? How is Jesus speaking? Now, although the how is important, perhaps the greater importance might be, what is Jesus saying to you? Is it a kind word, like a word of assurance? Or a challenging word like, surrender to me? Or a consoling word like, trust me, I got this? You know, rest assured, he is speaking, and when we listen well, we'll come to find out that he is preparing us for eternal life with him in glory forever.